The wind carried more than dust through Clearwater that morning. It carried whispers, low brittle ones that drifted from the saloon porch to the blacksmith's yard, winding their way toward the old sheriff's house. Folks didn't talk much about the past in this town, but when they did, her name always surfaced like a splinter in the skin. Clara Whitlow, the sheriff's wife who rode off one night and never looked back. Sheriff Eli Whitlow hadn't spoken her name in 3 years. Not once. Not when the preacher asked him to pray for forgiveness. Not when the deputy found her ribbon tangled in a fence post out by the hills. But every morning when the sun spilled over the mesas, he'd twist the gold band on his finger, worn dull by time, and look out toward the horizon. Folks took it as habit or madness, maybe both. He wasn't a young man anymore. The lines on his face were carved deep, the kind only loss can etch. Yet there was something unbroken in his stance, something that hadn't rusted. He still walked with the steady weight of a man who'd stared too long into the barrel of fate and decided to keep breathing. The badge still gleamed on his chest, but it didn't mean what it used to. Justice was a hollow word in Clearwater now. People came and went, drifters, gamblers, women with painted smiles, but none dared ask about Clara. Only old Hattie, the innkeeper, had once muttered that no woman rides off without reason. But Eli didn't answer her, and she never tried again. The town learned silence was safer. That morning, though, something shifted. The horizon was stained with the red dawn that promised trouble. A rider appeared out of the haze. A woman on a black mare, her hat pulled low, her coat covered in desert dust. She rode slow, like someone returning to a place they weren't sure still wanted them. Eli saw her from the office window. His heart gave a thud that felt unfamiliar, like a man hearing his own name called after years of silence. He stepped outside, boots heavy on the wood, eyes narrowing against the glare. The wind played tricks out here, turning shapes into ghosts, but this one didn't vanish. She stopped in front of the saloon, swung off her horse, and for a long moment the street went quiet. Every man, every whisper froze. She pulled off her hat, and her hair, shorter now, streaked by sun, fell loose against her face. Clara Whitlow, alive. The gold band on his finger burned cold. He didn't move, not even when she turned toward him. Her eyes were the same, storm gray and unreadable, but something in them had hardened. Whatever warmth she'd once carried had been traded for steel. She spoke, her voice low enough that only he could hear, though half the town was watching. The words were plain, almost cruel in their calm. Whatever she'd come for, it wasn't forgiveness. He stood there, silent, jaw tight. The years apart pressed between them like a wall. He saw every night he'd sat by the window listening for hoofbeats that never came. Every letter he never sent. Every prayer he stopped saying, and now she was back as if the years had been nothing but smoke. By sundown, the talk had spread through every corner of Clearwater. The sheriff's wife had returned. No one knew where she'd been or what she wanted. But Eli's silence spoke louder than any rumor. He didn't go home that night. Didn't light the lamp in his cabin or take off his gun belt. He stayed in the office watching the ring glint under the lamplight. He remembered the night she left, the storm breaking over the plains, the door slamming, the echo of her boots fading into the wind. He never chased her. Maybe he should have. Maybe he couldn't. The memories came in flashes. Her laughter on the porch, the way she'd hum while hanging laundry, the way her eyes had dimmed the day his duty took a darker turn. There'd been a shooting. A boy no older than 16 caught in the crossfire. Clara had begged him to leave the badge behind, to be just Eli again. But he couldn't. The law was all he had left of the man he used to be, and so she left him behind with it. The next morning he found her standing outside the church, the same black mare at her side. She looked out of place against the whitewashed walls, like a shadow refusing to fade. He stopped a few steps away. Neither spoke at first. The bell tolled once, faint and distant. Then she said something that hit harder than any bullet. Something about a grave out by the border towns. A child. The one she'd never told him about. The air between them cracked open. For the first time, Eli felt the ring tighten like a shackle. He turned away, not trusting his own voice. Behind him, Clara whispered something that only the wind carried. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was goodbye. But that night, when he finally sat by the window again, he didn't twist the ring. He took it off, laid it on the table, and watched the moonlight slide across it like water. And though he told himself it was over, a single thought clawed through his chest. If she came back once, she might not be done running. Eli didn't sleep that night. The whiskey stayed untouched on the desk, his badge lying beside the ring, both catching the faint flicker of the oil lamp. Outside, the crickets were loud enough to drown out his thoughts, but not the memories. He'd thought her gone for good. That was the only way a man could keep breathing, convincing himself she belonged to the wind, not to regret. But now she was back, walking the same streets where her name had become a ghost story. By sunrise, he'd made up his mind. He holstered his gun, took one last look at the ring, and slipped it into his pocket. Not to wear, not yet, but not to let go of either. The weight of it was both anchor and curse. When he stepped into town, the world was quieter than usual. Even the usual saloon noise had turned cautious. Men turned away when he passed. Women stopped whispering until he was gone. Everyone wanted to know what the sheriff would do. Arrest her, forgive her, or ride out again after her. But Eli didn't answer questions no one dared to ask. He found Clara where he expected, near the stables, brushing down her horse. The black mare looked half wild, the kind that didn't trust anyone but the one who tamed her. Clara had always been the same way. He stopped a few steps behind her, hands in his coat pockets. The smell of hay, leather, and faint lilac filled the air. For a long while, neither moved. It was like standing at the edge of a canyon, both knowing one word could send them tumbling. She finally broke the silence. Her tone wasn't bitter, but it carried something heavy, a truth she'd been dragging across miles. She told him she'd buried the child alone, that the fever had taken the boy before she could even whisper his name. He didn't know what to say, and maybe that was his greatest sin. For years he'd punished himself for not riding after her, but now he saw that nothing he could have said or done would have stopped her. The world had already taken more from her than she could bear. When she turned to face him, her eyes weren't cold anymore, just tired. There was no hate in them, only the hollow mercy of someone who'd already forgiven everything, even the unforgivable. She said she'd come back because the man responsible for that crossfire, the one who'd started it all, was back in Clearwater. A gunslinger named Jonas Reed. The name hit Eli like a hammer. Reed had been a ghost for years, thought long dead in the desert. He'd been the one Eli failed to catch, the reason that boy died, the reason Clara's heart had broken. Eli asked her how she knew, but she just gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, and said some debts can't stay buried forever. That evening, the storm rolled in from the west. The clouds stacked high and black, the kind that promised lightning and truth. Eli stood on the porch of his office, watching the rain smear the dust off the windows. He knew Reed wouldn't hide long. Men like him never did. When he finally showed, it was just past dusk. Reed walked into town with that same crooked grin, the kind that made people step aside without a word. He carried a scar down his cheek, a memory of a bullet Eli had once sent his way. Eli met him halfway down the street. No law, no badge, just two men with too many ghosts between them. The thunder cracked overhead and the whole town watched from behind half-closed shutters. Reed's hand hovered near his gun, his smirk mocking. He said something Eli didn't catch, maybe about Clara, maybe about the boy, but the meaning was clear. Eli didn't draw first. He never did. But when he did move, it was clean and sure, a motion carved by years of regret. The shot echoed off the buildings and rolled into the hills. Reed fell before the thunder faded. No one cheered. No one spoke. Justice had come too late to be called mercy. Eli stood there a long time, rain soaking his hat and coat, gun still warm in his hand. The ring in his pocket felt heavier than iron. When he turned, Clara was standing by the church steps, her face unreadable. For a moment he thought she might come closer. Instead, she looked past him, at Reed's body, at the gun, at the past that refused to stay buried. Then she walked away. He didn't follow her. Couldn't. The rain turned the street to mud as her boots faded into the distance. That night, Eli sat alone in his cabin, listening to the storm crawl across the plains. The gun lay on the table beside the ring. He wanted to believe this was the end, that the circle had closed, that the ghosts could rest now. But when he picked up the ring, it no longer felt like something sacred. It felt like a promise he'd broken twice, once by letting her go, and again by bringing her pain back to life. He slipped it back onto his finger anyway, the metal cold as the wind, and as he stared into the fire, he realized something no man wants to admit. Sometimes the law wins, but love doesn't. Morning crept into Clearwater with a slow gray light. The storm had passed, but the air still carried the scent of rain and gunpowder. The street was quiet again, almost peaceful, though everyone knew better. After every storm, the dust only settled for a while. Sheriff Eli Whitlow walked through the town like a man half made of shadow. Reed's body had been buried before sunrise, no word spoken. The undertaker said Clara had left before dawn, taking her black mare and nothing else. He wanted to believe it was over, that her coming back was just fate's cruel way of closing a chapter. But deep down he knew she hadn't ridden off for good. Clara didn't leave things unfinished. When he stepped into his office, a folded letter lay on his desk. No name on the front, just the faint imprint of a woman's hand that once knew his better than his own. The paper smelled faintly of lilac and rain. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat down, staring at it like it might vanish if he blinked. When he finally unfolded it, her handwriting swept across the page, the same soft curve, steady and sure, the same way she used to write the grocery lists on Sundays before everything fell apart. The letter began without greeting. She wrote of the boy, how he'd been born too soon, how the fever took him in the night, how she buried him under a cottonwood tree where the ground was soft. She said she'd spent the next 3 years looking for something to hate, but there was no one left to blame, not Eli, not even herself. Then she told him why she'd really come back. Reed hadn't just been her ghost. He'd been her secret. She'd found him years ago, hiding in a mining town down south. He'd begged her not to tell anyone, said he had no one left, said he'd lay down his gun for good. She'd believed him, given him food, even patched his wounds. But he'd betrayed her, stole her horse, left her stranded in the desert. When she heard he'd crawled back to Clearwater, she didn't come for revenge. She came to end the story that had ruined them both. But there was more. At the bottom of the page, in shaky handwriting, she wrote one last thing, something that made his hands go still. She said she'd found another grave out there in the desert, a woman's grave, with a locket that had belonged to Reed's mother. Inside it, she'd found a second ring, a twin to his. Eli read the words again and again, not understanding at first. Then it hit him. Reed hadn't come back just to settle scores. He'd been searching for something too, something buried with his own blood, and Clara had been caught in the middle. He folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, and walked outside. The town looked the same, but something beneath it had shifted. He could feel it, the quiet before another storm. By noon, he was on horseback heading toward the old border trail. The clouds had cleared, but the sun was harsh, burning off the last of the mud. Every hoofbeat echoed like memory. He found the cottonwood tree after 2 hours, twisted, half dead, its roots clutching the red earth. There was a small mound beneath it, marked by a smooth stone and a weathered ribbon. He knelt beside it, brushing away the dust, his chest tight with a grief that never aged. He stayed there until the wind turned cold, whispering through the branches like a voice from years gone. That's when he saw it. Another grave not far off. Smaller, marked with a cross carved out of driftwood. He knew this was the one Clara had written about. He dug with his hands until the edge of a wooden box showed. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was the locket. He opened it carefully. Inside were 2 small rings, identical, both gold, both marked with the same engraving on the inside. For what we can't undo. His breath caught. That was the phrase Clara had said on their wedding night, when he'd promised her forever and she'd whispered that forever wasn't always kind. It wasn't Reed's mother's locket. It was Clara's. The truth sank in slow. She hadn't buried another woman. She'd buried her old self, the one who'd loved him, lost him, and tried to find peace. This wasn't just a grave. It was her farewell. By the time he rode back to town, dusk had already painted the sky in shades of rust and smoke. He went straight to the inn, where Hattie met him at the door, her eyes wide. She said Clara had been there an hour ago, left him a key to one of the old rooms upstairs. Eli climbed the steps, heart pounding in his throat. The door creaked open and the room smelled faintly of lavender and dust. A single candle flickered on the table next to a folded note. This one was short. It said she was leaving for good, heading north to a town where no one knew her name. She didn't ask him to follow. She just wanted him to forgive himself. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the last train passing through, the one heading north. He could still catch it. For a long moment, he almost did. But then he looked at the badge lying on the table, the one he'd worn too long, and he knew. Some men aren't meant to chase what's already gone. When he finally stood, the candle had burned low. He took the ring from his pocket, kissed it once, and placed it beside her note. Then he walked out into the night, where the stars were the only witnesses left. The train's whistle had faded hours ago, but its echo lingered in Sheriff Eli Whitlow's bones like a ghost that wouldn't leave. The town of Clearwater slept, yet his mind roamed wide awake, drifting between what was and what would never be again. He sat outside his cabin, boots resting on the porch rail, the night air heavy with sagebrush and regret. The desert spread out in every direction, silver under the moonlight. He used to love that silence. Now it only reminded him how empty a man's heart could sound. The ring was gone, left on the table beside her note, but the skin beneath it still carried its mark, pale and permanent like a scar left by love that refused to fade. He told himself he'd done the right thing letting her go, that a woman like Clara deserved more than a man haunted by duty and ghosts. But when dawn came creeping over the plains, he still found himself glancing east toward the tracks as if expecting a miracle. By mid-morning, he forced himself back into routine. Paperwork, patrols, the slow grind of a lawman's life. But Clearwater had changed. The people looked at him differently now, not as their sheriff, but as a story. The man whose wife ran away twice and who still carried her name like a wound. That evening, a stranger rode into town. Not a gunslinger this time, not a drifter with a scarred face or a bounty on his head. This one was young, clean-shaven, carrying a leather satchel. He said he was from the Northern Territories, a messenger. He handed Eli a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. No name, no seal, just a single word scrawled across it. Clearwater. Eli waited until the man left before opening it. Inside was a folded piece of fabric, soft, faded blue, and a small photograph. The cloth was a child's blanket. The photograph showed a woman standing beside a grave marked by a wooden cross under a cottonwood tree. Clara. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, but her eyes held the same quiet strength. In her arms, she held a small bunch of desert flowers. On the back of the photo, in neat handwriting, was a single line. He would have been 7 this spring. Eli stared at it until the ink blurred. Then he set the picture on the desk and walked outside, where the wind was rising again, the kind that carried both sand and sorrow. He thought about the son he never met, the woman he'd failed to keep, and the law that had chained him to this lonely patch of earth. Some men build fences around their hearts. Others build prisons. Eli had built both. That night he didn't sleep. He rode out past the edge of town, toward the hills where the land split open like an old scar. The moonlight turned everything silver, and the only sound was the creak of his saddle. At the ridge he stopped and looked down at Clearwater. The town lights shimmered faintly below, small, fragile like a heartbeat too tired to keep going. He thought about hanging up the badge, about selling the cabin and starting somewhere new, maybe north where the cold could wash away what the desert burned into him. But he knew he wouldn't. The badge wasn't just metal. It was penance, a promise he couldn't unmake. Still, something shifted in him that night. For the first time, the ache didn't feel like punishment. It felt like memory, something to keep, not to bleed from. When he returned to town, dawn was breaking again. He found Deputy Cole waiting by the office steps, concern written all over his young face. Cole didn't ask where he'd been, just handed him a telegram. It was from a town up north. The message was short. Mrs. Whitlow passed peacefully. Asked that her letters be sent to you. The world went quiet. Eli read it again, slower this time, as if the words might change. But they didn't. The woman who'd haunted every step of his life was gone, finally out of reach, finally beyond the dust and the hurt. He sat down hard on the porch steps, the telegram trembling in his hands. The sun was just climbing over the hills, turning the world gold and cruelly beautiful. After a long while he stood, went inside, and opened the drawer where her first letter still lay folded beside the badge. He added the telegram beside it, closed the drawer, and locked it. Then, for the first time in years, he took off his hat, closed his eyes, and whispered her name aloud. Clara. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a prayer. It was a goodbye. Quiet, final, and free of the weight it once carried. He spent the rest of the day walking the edge of town, talking with people, fixing fences, patching roofs, small human things that made the world feel steady again. When night fell, he went to the saloon, sat in his usual corner, and listened to the piano. No one mentioned her. No one needed to. The whole town felt the change in him, the peace that comes only after you've lost everything worth fighting for and learned to live anyway. Before heading home, he looked up at the night sky one last time. The stars were bright, cold, endless, and silent. He smiled faintly. Maybe that was heaven's way of saying she'd found her peace too. Years passed quietly in Clearwater. The Rio. Desert wind still howled through the canyon at dusk, carrying sand and secrets. The saloon changed owners twice, the church added a new bell, and the train started stopping less often. But the sheriff stayed. Eli Whitlow grew older with the town. His hair went gray first, then silver, then thin at the temples. The lines on his face deepened like canyons carved by time. The people respected him, not because he carried a badge, but because he carried everything else with quiet strength. He never remarried. Folks asked why, but those who'd lived long enough to remember Clara already knew. Some loves don't end. They just fade into habit, into the way a man watches the horizon or the way his voice softens when he says her name under his breath. The letters from the north came one by one, sent by a preacher who'd known Clara in her final years. They weren't long, mostly scraps of her thoughts, journal pages she'd left behind. Eli read them slowly as if each word could bring her back. She wrote about the cold mornings, the kindness of strangers, the ache in her hands when winter came. She wrote that she'd found peace in tending to others, in helping widows and children with nowhere to go. But beneath all the gentle words was something that broke him, a quiet thread of love that had never unraveled. In one letter she wrote, "I used to think the desert took everything from us, Eli. But now I see it only stripped away what wasn't real. What was left, and that was love. The kind that doesn't die even when we do." He kept that letter in his coat pocket for the rest of his life. One summer evening, long after the telegram, and the morning had turned into memory, Eli rode out to the cottonwood tree, the same one that had weathered storms, heat, and time. The graves were still there, quiet under the red dust. He knelt between them, one hand resting on each mound. The earth was dry but warm, and a soft breeze lifted the brim of his hat. He spoke, then softly, like he was telling a story to someone half asleep, about the town, about the people, about how the sunset looked the same even when everything else changed. He told her he'd stopped wearing the ring, but never stopped carrying it. That sometimes, when the nights got too long, he'd hold it, tight in his palm, and imagine her laughter filling the room again. And then he smiled, the kind of small, tired smile that only a man who's made peace with the past can manage. That night, he stayed out there beneath the stars. The next morning, when Deputy Cole came looking for him, he found Eli leaning against the cottonwood tree, hat tilted low, eyes closed. The faintest trace of a smile still lingered on his face. The ring was in his hand. They buried him there, beside Clara and the child they never raised. The townsfolk came from miles around, miners, ranchers, widows, and wanderers. The preacher read a few quiet words, and when it was done, Hattie from the inn placed a single blue ribbon on the grave. Afterward, Deputy Cole took over the sheriff's post. He kept Eli's old badge hanging on the office wall, right above the desk where the first letter had once lain. Years later, travelers passing through Clearwater would hear the story about the sheriff whose wife ran away, but who never stopped wearing his ring. Some called it a tragedy, others a love story, but the old ones, the ones who remembered the man himself, would shake their heads and say it was neither. They said it was a lesson, that in the Wild West, love wasn't about holding on. It was about standing your ground even when the heart breaks wide open. And on certain nights when the wind blew just right across the plains, folks swore they could hear a woman's laughter drifting through the sagebrush. Soft, fleeting, like the memory of rain after a long drought. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe it was Clara, calling him home.